I wanted to just share with you a little bit of the overview of our work last night as a facilitation team. When you all went off to dinners, we gathered and we literally went room to room in all of the rooms that you met in, and we went through the outcomes of your sessions, and then we dug into the struggle. And we worked for several hours to come up with what will be presented this morning. And you know, it's the overview of that is like our post-industrial cities. This is a work in progress. There will be a lot more moving forward. Don and I will talk about next steps after the vote. But there was one theme that was really surprising when we went through the output from yesterday. We had the four themes that were framing the choices, and you know, it was a struggle among our program committee when we were formulating cross-cutting themes, and they were imperfect, and you made quick work of some of them. For instance, sustainability, a lot of the feedback was, you know, it's redundant in those cross-cutting themes because it's reflective of some of the other cross-cutting themes. Similarly, the idea of doing more with less, the wise allocation of resources, you know, people said that is such a topical now conversation. It's more, you know, if we're going to get into some real substance, it's more about the operational reality of how we change local government moving forward. It's not about doing more with less, and so a lot of folks were largely dismissive of that theme. However, the flip side of that is in every single workshop, at a broad thematic level, the thing that we will take away from your work yesterday and this convening as a whole is that equity has more urgency for the future success of our post-industrial cities than anything else that we discussed this week. It was a a high priority theme in every single workshop yesterday, and if we do nothing else moving forward from this convening, we will focus on that issue as the top priority issue for our post-industrial cities as an outcome of the conversations that took place this week. It was just utterly clear to us based on the conversations, and it was one of the few things that was so consistent across every single workshop. That said, we're going to delve into now some of the details and the propositions from each workshop. And with that, I will turn the podium over to our presenters from Workshop 1, which is Repositioning the Post-Industrial City in the Global Economy. And our presenters are Stephanie Daines and Ebony Robinson.
Good morning. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Ebony.
And we'd like to share with you our results from Workshop 1. David was absolutely right. You can't see anybody out here. It's very good. With all due respect to Don and Joel, they keep asking us to do impossible tasks. So with that in mind, we'll just forge ahead as we've been doing all along. Our workshop was inspired and shaped by our four speakers. Juan Alayo from Bilbao showed us what can be done when a city of less than 1 million people has the sustained political will to invest over 10 billion euros in 10 years, and challenged us to think hard about the real cost of our city's physical assets and the cost of maintaining those assets in the future. Larry Witzling observed that while Bilbao imported an American architect for its iconic landmark, Milwaukee's was the work of Calatrava from Spain. He vividly described these buildings as their city's hood ornaments. He stressed that post-industrial cities need to pursue their own unique future, that Milwaukee, unlike Pittsburgh, is successfully building its new generation of manufacturing back into the city, along with a rich mixture of urban amenities. Like Juan, he pointed out that cities today are making decisions that shape their future in the absence of a good knowledge base, that is, without understanding or accounting to their citizens for the actual cost of building or maintaining their essential infrastructure. Paul Gottlieb made a very strong impression on our discussions with his research showing that contrary to conventional economic wisdom, and I'm not sure I believe there is economic wisdom, cities that thrive do not depend on population growth, but rather on increasing the investment in the talent and earning capacity of their resident population. And Jennifer Vey introduced us to the emerging phenomenon of innovation districts, which demonstrate how that kind of investment in people, in their creative talent, and making places for their engagement can contribute to the prosperity and resilience of post-industrial cities. As Joel has just pointed out, one of the themes that emerged very quickly and strongly in our workshop was equity. The other was governance. That is, their fundamental role in creating sustainable prosperity. The workshop asserts today in our propositions that the task of economic systems in cities is to promote prosperity and opportunity equitably. Our propositions are grounded in recognizing the need for good governance, equitable governance, that is representative of all citizens, that is accessible to all citizens, and has the knowledge and leadership to act effectively on behalf of the common good. Our workshop's propositions call for an urban agenda that balances top-down decision-making with bottom-up initiatives, that balances fast-growing global interconnections with stronger and perhaps slower local economies and communities.
Yes. And with that being said, now for our contributions. Our first thing, post-industrial cities' greatest economic development strategy should be to invest in the education to cultivate the talent of their people. And now for your vote. Next, investing in neighborhoods for equity. Post-industrial cities need to commit to sustained investment in undervalued and blighted neighborhoods over the long term. They must demonstrate measurable strategies to achieve social and economic equity.
Time to vote.
And now for the third proposition, redesign urban accounting for sustainability. Make post-industrial cities more accountable to the principles of sustainability through a new system of urban triple bottom line accounting. Moving on to our next proposition. Create innovation districts. Cities should create local innovation districts that leverage existing assets, attract investment, benefit investors, and create equity for the proximate community, encouraging diverse uses and activities that support innovation. And the final proposition we put before you is to form municipal leagues. Post-industrial cities around the world should form municipal leagues in order to consolidate their power, resources, and ability to affect change. We thank you for your input on our propositions. Before we depart the stage, we also want to thank the members and the participants in our planning sessions that actually committed to carrying forth pieces of these propositions in their daily work to tackle that urgency issue. How do we affect change now? And I'll leave you with a few of those commitments by participants in our planning session. I will develop high-quality, affordable housing in the urban core to create denser, more livable environment. I will lobby local government to advocate better priorities in governance. I will provide transformation management to bring better balance between top-down and bottom-up strategies. I will write urban codes that protect both urban and rural assets. I will help fix old parks and make new ones. We will develop infrastructure resilience plans for our city that support adaptive reuse and diverse economies. I will research metropolitan governance structures, and I will complete my database of urban indicators. Thank you all.
Theme workshop number 2 is Post-Industrialism in the Physical City, and our presenters are Michael and Chris from Theme Workshop 2.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I missed a few of you on the bike ride at 6 a.m., so I apologize if I'm a little sleepy, but sorry. I thought you wanted Chris closer to me, so thank you so much for coming out, and I missed you this morning when we were out bicycling at 6 a.m., but I also wanted to thank everyone for putting this on. It's really been a learning experience for me to be here and to work with all the different delegates on this session. I know we were struggling to wrap all the different ideas into the sort of the summary that we're going to present here. I felt like a director having to cut my movie down to about 5 minutes when it should have been a 3-hour-long movie. So as we go through this, we're going to sort of summarize all the different things, and I do apologize for all the things that ended up on the editing floor, but this is what I think our next session will be about.
Yeah.
So.
We definitely tried to capture everything, and we really appreciate everybody who was part of our session. We had some really great, intense conversations, and I think everybody's really engaged for next steps, so we're really looking forward to how to continue this conversation and put some of those issues that we couldn't include today back on the table.
Okay. So our charge was the post-industrial physical city, and we have a little start here. We, the facilitators of Group 2, in order to develop a more sustainable city, have adopted these truths to be self-evident. We believe that the community members are the decision makers for change. We believe that design of the physical city should create social equity. We believe that the access to a fully functioning and fully funded multimodal transportation system provides for an equitable and sustainable region. We believe everyone has a right and responsibility to live in a safe neighborhood. We believe that urban areas should be a shared and valued amenity, and therefore we must make choices that are systemic rather than individualistic. We believe that businesses have a role and responsibility to be members of their surrounding communities. We believe the physical city should support and integrate with the natural environment. We believe the physical city needs to be designed and built to be resilient to a changing global climate. Okay? I could go on from there, but we thought we'd limit it to 20, so.
So now we're going to do the voting. Our group really challenged ourselves to try to think outside the box, so we're hoping to get the least amount of ones in the session today, and hopefully create some dialogue about why people believe or don't agree with our statements. So the first one is adaptive and flexible housing. The post-industrial cities of the future must develop housing and policies that allow for adaptive and changing communities and demographics with the goal of providing different opportunities over multiple life stages. All-cost accounting. The post-industrial cities of the future must change the paradigm of economic development to include full and complete public costs in decisions. We're getting better. Financial incentives for reuse. The post-industrial city of the future must develop a wider range of creative financial incentives to encourage residents and small developers to reuse existing lands, buildings, and neighborhoods. Community investment. The post-industrial cities of the future must create innovative financial and wealth-building strategies for development of the physical city. These include community-invested development, community land banking, microloan programs, and rent-to-own programs. And this one is really hard for me because I really love coffee, but no more funds for coffee houses. The post-industrial city of the future must stop public funding of communities that have tipped their markets. Love it.
Good.
Our job here is done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
theme workshop number 3 is the 21st century city as an innovation hub, and we have Rob and Eric from theme workshop number 3.
Thanks, Joel. The notion of the 21st century city as an innovation hub was a topic that our group took on, and I think the results are pretty interesting. We started our session with folks like Kevin Stollerich, the Director of Research for the Martin Prosperity Institute, talked about what's happening in Toronto as kind of a booming city in North America, its growth, charting its growth and where its work sectors are, and also how they're controlling density. Very interesting discussions. Thanasis Rakakis, for the Vice Provost for Design, Arts and Technology at Carnegie Mellon, really challenged everyone in the room with a different way to think about problem solving and how economies work, how we make decisions on a day-to-day basis about where resources go and how they're connected. Giuseppe Rotolo from the European Commission talked in a way about a very high-level effort in the EU to influence the way cities are thinking about innovation and are able to respond and work in collaboration. And then my friend Eric Bouchard, who gave us a remarkable story about Manchester and Leeds, was with, Liverpool. I like to talk about Leeds too, but Liverpool is another one of those little gems of a city on the coast there, and the sort of competition between those two cities for market share and the way they've interacted over time and emerged as they are on their journey in the post-industrial economy. Eric is going to provide a kind of overview. He was able to visit all of the 3 sessions where we broke into groups to talk about these issues, and I think the perspective, particularly from Europe, is very interesting on this whole subject of cities as an innovation hub. Eric.
Thanks a lot, Rob. It's nice to see everyone again. Be on the podium. I'd like to say that was due to popular vote, but I've got absolutely no evidence of that. So I just would like to say it's a pleasure to represent the group. I worked so hard over the days on this tricky issue of innovation, which meant so many things to so many people. But I think you'll agree we've come up with some amazing propositions. I just wanted to split my remarks in 2. First, to address specifically my reflection on the things that we talked about in our group, and then at Rob's invitation, just to really say a few things about the differences that I've noticed about how you're thinking about things here in the United States and how we've dealt with things in Europe. So first thing I want to say is that the diversity of ideas and discussions around innovation was very pleasing to me. Those of you who heard me in my opening remarks the other day knew that I was a bit concerned that we were going to focus on technology, R&D, and the kinds of, I suppose, solutions that may not be attainable or approachable for many people. In many ways, innovation can appear to many people as an elitist idea that really doesn't soak into the fabric of the majority of the parts of our cities. And I think we avoided that. You make your own mind up about that. But I was pleased that I thought we didn't fall into that trap. The other thing I think we did, and actually I see it in the first 2 groups, that I think we're going to see it with everybody else as well, that there's a richness of concern about socio-economic innovation right across the piece, and we were no different. And of course, that's not really surprising to us practitioners and academics, that we need to fix our cities in the physical sense, but ultimately, and loads of people have made this point over the past few days, it's all about people. Ultimately, it's about people and the environment, and so I think you'll see that comes through in ideas around education, around equity and cohesion. We've got ideas around capacity building and placemaking, all around innovating those ideas, and also access to skills and the promotion of innovation to those who have not been able to take advantage of some of the benefits that can bring to them and their communities. Not so much, although a lot of discussion around the role of universities, which was interesting to me, a bit surprising. I guess it's kind of imbued across the piece that we would expect that to be the case, but actually, and those academics in the room may disagree with me, but my experience is that our university is still very geared up to be the best they could be in an international arena, and don't always pay cognizance to what's going on right over the boundary of the fence. And I think that's a mistake. I think we need to address that. Okay, well, I just want to say a few more things before we do the voting on my reflection on how things have panned out in post-industrial cities either side of the pond. Some are obvious, but you should be aware that, and I think Corinne made this point really well with one of our slides, you have got loads of space, and we really haven't. And it really has focused the whole built form and the way that we travel, interact, and manage our affairs. And that is a major difference, and yet I think we can learn from each other in the way that post-industrial cities on both sides of the water are thinking about occupying that space in terms of sustainability, connectivity, and cohesion. The next point was this disparity between regions and also between economic groups. And I have to say that the United States has a further divergence of both of these than we do in Europe. That's not to say that there's pockets and places in Europe which have serious problems. But I think that this is a really serious issue, and many people have mentioned it. It really was brought home to me that this is something that you need to address as a matter of urgency. But having said that, you've also got a huge third sector, philanthropic community, which we really don't. We are very dependent on public sector to deliver services over in Europe. And it's created a dependency culture which isn't healthy. And that also breeds a sort of paternalistic form of governance, which again does undermine citizen mobilization. And I think you're doing much better at that than we are, by and large. Of course, all of these things I'm saying are huge generalizations, so forgive me for doing that. Public transport, something that related to my point I just made, is a way of life. It's not stigmatized in any part of Europe that I know of, but there is still an issue here about just taking a bus, never mind providing public transport services. And I think that a few people have mentioned that, and there's some propositions that we've already heard to address that. And finally, I was really surprised about how many speakers and participants talked about regionalism. I wasn't really expecting that. I don't think either Europe or the United States have really come to grips properly with regionalization and what that's going to mean and the changes of the governance patterns that it's going to require to make it work really well. And then there's the other side of the coin, and that's local participation, which everybody has talked about. But I was really struck by Don Edwards' remarks just in the session before, and I really want to emphasize this. We talk all the time about top-down versus bottom-up, which most of us would agree is a pretty dry and sort of silly argument, because, of course, we need both. But there isn't enough talk, I don't think, about the role of the top to resource the bottom in terms of capacity building and enabling. It's fine to invite people to the party. It's not fine to expect decisions which are informed, which is what Don was just telling us, in a meaningful way that isn't exclusive, unless we build capacity and invest in that part of the democratic process. So, coming full circle, the innovative element that you're going to hear and vote about, I think, is changing some of those cultural and embedded issues and focusing on the governance issue to really make sure that we can use the next 25 years, or I hope less, to cope with dangerous climate change, the democratic divide, the economic divide in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go through the propositions here for our team. The first proposition was the notion, actually, of returning to a much earlier idea in economic development in the city as an innovation hub. And that's the idea that more resources should go to the smallest increment in the neighborhood, cottage industries, the return to cottage industries, but in a very 21st century way. So this proposition states that cities must create street-level incubators that respond to local needs, aspirations, and generate economic growth by accelerating the cycle from invention to innovation to production. Terrific. The second proposition came out of a discussion about, in this country, largely the disappearance of the library in all of our lives as a kind of touchstone for how we identify our communities and a great asset and resource that we all grew up with. We're fortunate in Pittsburgh to have a remarkable system that was also, in a way, a gift to the philanthropic community that drove Pittsburgh for so long. But the notion of reconceiving the library again as a kind of center for neighborhoods was what this proposition took on. So the library is infotech. We must reinvent libraries as critical hubs in urban neighborhoods that act as portals for lifelong learning, access to information, and places for social interaction in the 21st century. We see this happening in many communities, and we think that this notion of completely sort of taking the idea of libraries apart and putting it back together in very different ways for cities is essential to compete in the 21st century economy. This third proposition was the notion of creating sticky cities, and which I love the term. But this idea that you would sort of redevelop, clear, and become whatever the sort of state of design and fashion is at the moment is not essential to competing as we move forward between cities and attracting talent. So this is a notion about both preserving those qualities that we have here that are so unique in our cities, and then building on that as a kind of DNA to advance our cities into the future. So this proposition says that communities must identify and harness the unique assets of their places, physical, cultural, technological, human, natural, and that's a Pittsburgh term for everything else, to attract and retain people who will invest and grow new businesses here. So it is like our languages. It is all these regional differences and continental differences that make make an amazing place. So this proposition we feel pretty strongly about as a sort of basic tenet. In the next proposition, this one is pretty straightforward. The idea of redistributing wealth. No surprise here. We have a lot of discussion on this side of the Atlantic about 99% versus 1%. That's not getting much better. So this whole notion that cities should begin to direct innovation funding to include a portion of the resources invested to training, education, mentoring, and participation for underserved communities. This is a theme that I think you've seen that crosses over many of the workshop boundaries. And then the final proposition from our workshop was, let's just blow up education. We've been working on this for a long time, and we all know it's a difficult issue. and some cities are making great progress in it. But this group felt that if you adapt the same administrative and operational structure, we're just not really thinking out of the box. We need to completely eliminate the box and start over and rebuild the foundation for cities to remain healthy and become lifelong places for us in the future. So the idea that cities must reinvent a neighborhood-based education system that grows from the values and aspirations of citizens, discard the current administrative structure, and adapt to local context. Thanks very much.
Okay, theme workshop 4 was Urban Systems, Infrastructure in the Post-Industrial City, and we have Steve and Christine to report on that one.
Good morning. Our group was on urban systems and infrastructure. We first started off with 4 very provocative and very interesting 2 case studies and messages from our thought leaders. Maurice Cox from Tulane University spoke about New Orleans and how through the democratic process, heritage as well as history was preserved in redoing the infrastructure from damage from Hurricane Katrina. Nico Tilley from Delft University presented a case study about Rotterdam, and in this man versus nature history of over several hundred years, that one can create infrastructure that not only is innovative, but also beautiful in the process. Both of those case studies really both demonstrated the power of place. And the message out of that was that everybody who lives in cities really does believe very strongly in that place quality of where they live, where they were born, or wherever they may end up, as being extremely powerful. And in this case, a lot of times, so powerful to overcome adversity through catastrophe and overcome this whole notion about how one goes about investing in infrastructure. Vivian Lofness made a very interesting proposition to us that we already have too much infrastructure. And what we need to do now is reuse and prioritize what we have to make it better. Gordon Price from Simon Fraser University in Toronto made a very interesting point to all of us that we do more planning and actually accomplishment of infrastructure by our government and actually by the military in this country, because by responding to catastrophe, it is those, particularly in this case, the Army Corps of Engineers in this country, who really make the long-lasting and almost urban design decisions for us, much to the degree that even urban designers are somewhat marginalized in that process. We had a very feisty group, and actually a group that challenged even the propositions put forward by Bruce Katz and Richard Florida. And the message out of this was, it's a very good reminder that single solutions are not necessarily appropriate at all scales, because we had people represented from villages all the way to major cities. And what might be good for Chicago or New York or even Pittsburgh is not necessarily good at the very local level where where people live in very different situations all the time. So the message out of that was, be careful, that infrastructure needs to be place-based and it needs to be very democratic in the process. We did come together on 2 issues, though. One was equity, as you've heard from everybody else. And in the case of infrastructure, a lot of times investments are placed for several reasons about how things get invested in. One is, even though we may have a participatory type of process, it's those who speak the loudest a lot of times are the ones that are heard. We also have a tendency to invest where we can see there may be more economic benefit out of that investment and not necessarily making it equitable across the board. So our group was very strong on we must be inclusive and we must create infrastructure where there are opportunities for all of us, no matter what your background, no matter what your economic status and so on, that we must do this across the board and do it equally. The second one, which carried through all of ours, was this whole notion of prioritization. And what is it that we seem to feel is important? And what came out of our group very strongly, that we must realize that the natural systems, even though we're in this constant battle of man versus nature, that it's the natural systems is where we need to learn from. And that's where we need to seek where we should prioritize. Once we understand and work with them, we will be much more effective in the long run. I'm going to turn this over to Christine to talk about our propositions.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. So it's my job to get you all as excited about these propositions as we are. First of all, we took a little shift, and we thought that these weren't separate propositions, but they're actually planks on a platform. So we hope that you will agree that if we're thinking about integrated systems, integrated urban systems, we need to be thinking about synthetic platforms of propositions. To that effect, our first proposition is shifting infrastructure decision-making. Revolutionize infrastructure decision-making to ensure integrated, ecologically, economically, and socially brilliant futures. Integrate soft and hard and local, regional water, food, heat, power, mobility, not transportation, and data voice, connectivity, infrastructures to ensure quality of life and equity. So the key words in this are infrastructure and integrated and decision-making. If we reconceptualize infrastructure not simply as the pipes but also the flow, then that means we don't simply plan highways, but we look at the systems by which we move around. And with the emergence of technology to support new ways of relating to each other, or as simply as we all know things that enable things like car sharing or bike sharing, we believe that technology and the emergence of data will really allow us to explore this kind of soft infrastructure side of things. So shifting infrastructure decision-making to account for these things, we think, is one of the big things that need to happen in the next 25 years. With that, we vote. Our second proposition is, as Steve alluded to, prioritizing natural systems. We believe that we need to prioritize natural systems and their contributions to ensure resiliency in the face of resource shortages and climate change. The whole question of equity is turned on its head when resources become short and climate change affects people and challenges our notions of environmental justice. We need to prioritize natural systems and think about an urban metabolism. This is what allows us to think of landscape as infrastructure and talk about ecological services. We believe that this will be important in the next 25 years. And now we vote. Our third proposition: use infrastructure to empower people. Invest in infrastructures through public engagement to create inspiring places that catalyze grassroots creativity and create a ladder to equity. This picks up on themes that we've heard in others, but there's a really important piece of this that is unique to infrastructure. There are fundamental shifts that require us to move from thinking about participation to engagement, with the decentralization of infrastructure and the presence of big data to shift with the locus of power. We need to be especially attentive to those who may not have access to this or may be able to use these as opportunities to create lifestyle and careers. In this aspect, we have to think of infrastructure not simply as the product, but also as a process where the race is really the prize. Time to vote on this one, and we hope you will agree with us that this will be important for the next 25 years. Okay, our fourth proposition. is align governance to system scale. This one we know is going to be difficult and very, very challenging. This is about reconceptualizing governance to align with the scale of the system and to create visionary alliances to futurize our infrastructure. Alliances may be based on regions, resources, amenities, or the capacity of citizens, professionals, governments, foundations, and corporations that make up our civic life. This is important to push for because when we think about how things are regulated, our frustrations or our victories often come with the scale at which that occurs. Watersheds, farm sheds, and air sheds are all going to be important as we take on the question of infrastructure in the future. We believe this will be important and essential to make progress in the next 25 years, and we'd like to know your opinion. Our final proposition is redirect national security investments. I'm going to read this one first and then tell you a little bit about what that means. Redirect investments in climate change, resilience, and national security into infrastructure, innovation, and economic development to benefit the greatest number of citizens. Resiliency in the face of climate change is not optional. Infrastructure is essential. And national security is not simply the military complex, but needs to be considered as part of the role of infrastructure in the face of climate change. We believe that if we can appropriate resources that are currently being used for similar purposes, but not necessarily being thought of as place-based exercises, that we can find a locus of resources to create better communities while also solving some of our infrastructure problems. We'd like to know what you think. Thank you.
I would just like to say thank you. Our group had over 60 propositions for our facilitator team of 6 to work down to these 5. But I also want to thank not only the facilitators, but all of you in our group who participated. We had a very strong group, very opinionated, but we all got together and we felt extremely productive throughout the course of the day. And thank you.
Our final theme workshop number 5, is Planning and Social Innovations for the Post-Industrial City, and we have Jonathan and Sala to report out on that.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So we're the last but not least, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how our process went, who we heard from, some of the themes we talked about, and then Sala will present the propositions. So we started by just trying to sort out a little bit different definitions in the room between the word planning and the word social, which we found were actually very diverse amongst our group. And then we really got into sort of the larger issues of equity and inclusion. And, you know, I would say one of the conference themes was equity and one of them was engagement. And, you know, everyone in the room immediately, and I'd say probably everyone in this conference, agrees with the idea that we should create, as planners, inclusive processes, that inclusion in the process is really, really important. Process that engages as many people as possible. But in our groups, there was sort of a strong sentiment, and I would say we were channeling Don Edwards' talk a bit from this morning, in that if we want equity, if we're really serious about it, we need to create an inclusive city. An equitable process is not enough. We need to have an equitable result. So we need an equitable city, a just city, and an inclusive city. And that conversation, I'd say, informed the various conversations we were having in the separate groups in the room. And we started to organize our ideas around a series of questions that we had sort of brought to the group to start with. The first tried to think about how do we reinvent the city in response to larger economic and demographic shifts that we see in the post-industrial city. And a proposition was made that if we do need to remake the city, or we do need to reinvent it, that it needs to be around the soul of the city, around its identity, its history, its values, and that reinvention needs to create spatial, social, and economic justice. And that means stopping displacement. It means actually investing in our communities, many of the things we've heard in many of the propositions already this morning. The second group of ours focused on addressing inequality. What strategies could we actually use to do that? Inequality and environmental justice. And one of the themes there was trying to connect larger issues of mobility and the built environment, and really organize cities around more affordable and equitable means of access, such as transit, but also other means. There also was much discussion, I think also like in other groups, about how can we reinvent our decision-making structures and mechanisms for allocating resources in ways that shift power to communities, particularly communities that have been marginalized or disenfranchised in some way. And our third group, their charge was to think about maintaining, revitalizing, and sort of growing the city in the face of shrinking resources. I'd say both the second and third one talked about rethinking community investment mechanisms, and there was a lot of discussion about one specific to America or specific to England that can promote community-scale microeconomics and make investments in communities really accountable to communities. So again, shifting the power down to the scale of community. Much discussion also, like in other groups, about how do we focus or foster and build entrepreneurial capacity from the ground up within our communities, and how do we do it for the long run, for the long haul, in a continuous manner as opposed to sort of bursts of planning processes, etc. And then our fourth group kind of talked about how do we balance top-down versus bottom-up, and really urged that we build capabilities at the grassroots, again, for the long term, building both participation and leadership. And how do we create structures and the kind of civic infrastructure that Don was talking about before the propositions to do that. They also brought forward an interesting idea that if we're really serious about this idea of remaking the city or reinventing the city around an understanding of its true soul, that we need to think about the way that we analyze and try to understand the city, and that we find ways to really equally value subjective and objective measures of the city, understandings of the city, and find tools to do that. I'd say at the beginning of our group, so we heard from Tony Griffin talking about Detroit and the reinvention of Detroit. We heard from Anna Pratt talking about Torino in Italy and Torino's kind of history of planning and its recovery after the collapse of its industry. And then we heard two provocative sort of thought leaders, Henk Dittmar, who all of you heard from, spoke a lot about essentially shifting decision-making and allocation kind of abilities in England through to the scale of communities. And then finally, our last speaker was Mindy Fullilove, who really challenged everyone in the room, I would say, and talked about something completely different. She didn't talk about a plan or a planning example. And I think gave us the charge to take the issue of equity, marginalization, displacement, and an inclusive city very seriously. So in the beginning, I'd say we thought that, I think because the issues in our group are very difficult to find the answer to, they're very difficult issues to deal with, especially those of us who are on the ground planning in communities. We know this. And we were afraid that so we thought that, oh, this is going to be an impossible task to get propositions about this at the end. But what we found when we went around the groups at the end of the night was that we had actually maybe come the closest to having the propositions we ended up with by 5 o'clock of perhaps any of the teams. And I think it's because this issue of equity, as Joel said, was really rising to the top across the whole conference. And then for those of you who are in the sessions, the propositions you'll see are quite similar. We've merged some of them. But at the end of the night, we really felt like one thing we had not reached and we really needed to add one. And that was really truly taking head on and facing the larger structures of racism and marginalization that are in some ways, as some said, in some cases specific to the American post-industrial context, but manifest themselves in different ways across the pond. So with that, I'll hand it over to Salahuddin, who's going to read the propositions.
Thank you. Good morning. They all boil down to these propositions. The first one is cultivate the soul of the city. We need urban justice. The city of 2040 starts from the understanding of its soul, its people, its identity, and its values. Now pick up your thing and hit number 1 or number 2. I come from city council. What do you want? Gee. Number 2, grow entrepreneurial capacity. The city of tomorrow must cultivate the dormant entrepreneurial capacity of its people in order to rebuild rich, vibrant, adaptable communities, thus creating a strong sense of place. Now vote. Thank you. Number 3, we must connect the city. The city of tomorrow must provide transit and alternative modes of transportation to ensure that all communities have access and connectivity to jobs, to education, to food, housing, and services. Connectivity. Number 4, we want to balance the subjective data with the objective understanding. The city of tomorrow must equate the importance of subjective and objective data in decision-making to inform its plan. Okay, we're going on to number 5. We need to redefine government and governance. We must redefine government to respond more efficiently to its people and economic opportunities, then target resources to the equitable vision and will of the people. This next one is about displacement, urban displacement. Permanent displacement from one's community creates economic and social fractures. We must place a 25-year moratorium on displacement. A 25-year moratorium on permanent displacement. Please vote. Our final proposition is to confront racism and marginalization. We must muster the courage to confront and expose racism and other forms of marginalization within ourselves, the economy, the criminal justice system, the education system, and throughout society to truly create cities with liberty and justice for all. If that's not number one for you, you're in the wrong conference. 78%. Very good. Thank you.
Okay, what we wanted to do, and we're doing things on the fly this morning, what we wanted to do is briefly have some reflections from just a couple of people who have been intricately involved in the Congress. So if those people would begin to come forward, I'm going to turn the podium over to my colleague Don Carter, and I just want to thank once again the facilitation team and delegates that worked late into the night on putting those propositions together. Absolutely.